John F. Kennedy International Airport hummed with the familiar rhythm of travel rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the distant crackle of announcements over the intercom. It was early evening, and the terminal was bathed in the soft amber glow of artificial lighting. For most, the day was winding down. But for others, like those waiting to board Flight 832 to Phoenix, the journey was just beginning. Michael Thompson stood near Gate 42, tapping absent-mindedly on his phone. A young entrepreneur in his early 30s, Michael had the quiet confidence of someone used to navigating busy terminals and unfamiliar cities. He adjusted his jacket, preparing for the cross-country flight that would bring him one step closer to a critical business pitch. He was used to these trips, though the long hours away from his family weighed on him more than he liked to admit. A few seats away, Sarah Williams sat with her legs crossed, a well-worn leather briefcase at her feet. She watched the boarding area with an expression that seemed both distant and deeply aware. Sarah, a civil rights attorney for over 3 decades, had seen more of life's injustices than she cared to count. Yet, even with her years of experience, there was something about airports, these microcosms of society, that often left her feeling uneasy. Perhaps it was the unspoken hierarchy, the way people sized each other up in the few seconds it took to pass by. David Harris lingered near the window, his carry-on resting against his leg. A college professor in his 50s, David had just finished presenting at a conference on African American literature. His mind drifted to the students waiting for him back home, and he smiled faintly. Teaching had been his life's calling. But the more he taught, the more he realized how much of the world's weight his students carried with them. He often wondered if they knew he carried some of it too. The announcement for pre-boarding cut through the murmur of the crowd. Michael grabbed his laptop bag. Sarah gathered her papers, and David adjusted his glasses. Strangers to one another, they moved toward the gate, each caught up in the quiet rituals of air travel boarding passes, ID checks, the polite smiles exchanged with gate agents. Inside the plane, the atmosphere was typical: narrow aisles, overhead bins filling quickly, and the familiar challenge of finding one's seat. Michael settled into his window seat, pulling out his phone to send a quick text. Sarah placed her briefcase under the seat in front of her, nodding at the elderly man seated beside her. David found himself by the wing, staring out at the darkening sky. The flight attendants moved efficiently, their practiced smiles never wavering. Among them was John, a tall man with neatly combed hair and a crisp uniform. He greeted passengers as they boarded, his tone professional but distant. For Michael, Sarah, and David, this was just another flight. They hadn't noticed the small glances, the fleeting expressions, or the subtle shifts in tone. Not yet. As the plane filled, the usual pre-flight routine unfolded: safety demonstrations, last-minute adjustments, the faint anticipation that marked the beginning of every journey. The passengers were strangers, united only by the shared purpose of getting to Phoenix. But even in moments of shared purpose, differences lingered. Sometimes, those differences stayed beneath the surface, unnoticed, unspoken. Other times, they rose up, sharp and undeniable, forcing themselves into the quiet spaces of ordinary life. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Welcome aboard Flight 832. We'll be departing shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed." Michael looked out the window. Sarah leaned back in her seat, and David opened his notebook. They had no way of knowing that the flight they were about to take would be anything but ordinary. 40. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang Tu Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 2. The Incident. The hum of the engines had barely begun to fill the cabin when the murmurs started. A flight attendant, John, moved deliberately down the aisle, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet. His demeanor was professional, his expression neutral, but there was a faint tightness to his movements that suggested an unspoken tension. Michael Thompson noticed it first. From his window seat, he saw John pause at the row behind him, lean in close to a passenger, and whisper something. The passenger nodded, hesitant, and John moved on, his gaze sweeping over the cabin. Michael shrugged it off, assuming it was a routine check. A few rows away, Sarah Williams glanced up from the book she had just opened. She caught the briefest flicker of discomfort on another passenger's face, an older woman seated near the aisle, as John spoke quietly to her. The woman didn't respond but pressed her lips together in a way that seemed to speak volumes. Sarah's instincts, honed over years in courtrooms, prickled faintly. David Harris, seated by the wing, noticed nothing at first. He was too engrossed in jotting down notes for his lecture on the Harlem Renaissance. But when John stopped beside him, his words cut through David's concentration. "Sir," John said, his tone polite but firm, "could I ask you to step off the plane for a moment?" David blinked, surprised. "Is there a problem?" "It's just a quick check," John replied, his expression carefully blank. David hesitated but complied, grabbing his bag and stepping into the aisle. He glanced around as he moved, catching Sarah's eye. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Within minutes, 7 more passengers, all black, were asked to deplane. Each time, John's voice was calm, his explanation vague. Michael was among them, as was Sarah. The passengers left their seats reluctantly, their confusion muted but palpable. On the jet bridge, the group of 8 stood in awkward silence, exchanging uncertain glances. Sarah was the first to speak. "Does anyone know what this is about?" Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness beneath it. Michael shook his head. "They didn't say anything to me. Just asked me to step out." David looked around, his brow furrowed. "This doesn't make any sense." Before anyone could say more, John appeared, flanked by a gate agent named Lisa. Lisa's expression was apologetic but restrained, as though she were navigating a delicate situation. "We've received a complaint," Lisa began, her tone measured. "One of the passengers reported an odor issue in the cabin, and we need to address it before we can proceed." There was a pause, heavy and loaded. Michael opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. Sarah, however, stepped forward. "An odor issue?" she repeated, her voice low but firm. "And how exactly was that determined to involve us?" Lisa hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to John. "The report didn't specify," she said. "We're just following up to ensure everyone's comfort." David folded his arms. "Comfort? You removed 8 passengers without any evidence or explanation. This doesn't feel like comfort, it feels like something else." The others murmured in agreement, their voices a mix of confusion and growing frustration. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "Look," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "This is just protocol. We're doing our best to resolve the situation quickly." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Protocol that only seems to apply to us. Would you like to explain that?" John cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We're trying to handle this discreetly," he said. "If there's been a misunderstanding, we'll address it." "A misunderstanding?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge now. "Or is it something more? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like discrimination." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Lisa glanced at John, who avoided her gaze. Back in the terminal, passengers waiting for their flights watched as the group stood near the gate, their confusion slowly giving way to quiet resolve. Michael reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before hitting the record button. "I think we deserve an explanation," he said, holding his phone at his side. Lisa looked at the camera, then at John. "We're working on it," she said finally, her voice barely audible. As the minutes ticked by, the underlying tension in the room grew. It was the kind of tension that many of the passengers had felt before, not always in such a direct way, but familiar nonetheless. It was the tension of being seen but not truly seen, of being judged without ever being heard. Eventually, the group was allowed to reboard, but the mood on the plane had shifted. The glances from other passengers were sharper now, more curious, and perhaps more uncomfortable. Michael, Sarah, and David returned to their seats. But the incident lingered. Unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. Sometimes, the quiet moments told the loudest stories. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 3 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Doc Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Ila Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. The jet bridge was unnervingly quiet. The air outside the plane was cooler than expected, though not enough to ease the unease that hung over the group of 8 passengers now standing together. The metallic hum of the airport, usually a distant background noise, felt sharper, like the sound was closing in. Sarah Williams crossed her arms, her briefcase resting against her leg. She didn't like the way this was unfolding, not just the removal, but the silence that followed it. A career spent confronting uncomfortable truths had taught her to listen for what wasn't being said. And here, the silence felt heavier than words. Lisa, the gate agent, approached cautiously. She carried an air of authority, but it was tempered by a kind of practiced politeness that didn't quite mask her discomfort. Behind her, John stood with his arms at his sides, his expression unreadable. "We appreciate your patience," Lisa began, her voice calm but measured. "We're working to resolve this situation quickly." "Patience?" Michael Thompson asked, his tone even. He held his phone loosely in his hand. "The camera's still recording. You've pulled us off the plane, grouped us together, and given us no explanation beyond a vague, odor complaint. And now you're asking for patience?" Lisa shifted her weight. "I understand how this might feel," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady but with a precision that made everyone listen. "No, you don't understand, because if you did, you wouldn't have handled it this way." She glanced at John. "Let's start with the basics. Who made the complaint?" "That's confidential," Lisa said quickly. "Convenient," Sarah replied, her tone cooling slightly. "And who decided we were the problem?" There was a brief silence. John cleared his throat. "I was following up on the complaint. It's standard procedure to address these issues discreetly." Discreetly? David Harris, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "If this is your idea of discretion, I'd hate to see what blatant looks like." The group murmured in agreement. One of the other passengers, a middle-aged woman with braids and a sharp gaze, shook her head. "This isn't about discretion," she said. "This is about bias. You don't need to say it for us to see it." Lisa opened her mouth as if to respond, but Sarah held up a hand. "Let's stay focused. You're telling us that out of all the passengers on that plane, we were the only ones removed because of a subjective complaint. No evidence, no verification, just someone's word?" "Like I said," Lisa replied, her voice faltering slightly, "we're following protocol." Sarah took a step closer, her posture calm but unyielding. "Protocol that conveniently targets people who look like us. Tell me, is that written down somewhere? Or is it just something you've learned to enforce without thinking twice?" Lisa glanced at John, as though seeking support, but John's expression remained neutral, his hands clasped behind his back. The tension in the air grew thicker. Other passengers in the terminal had begun to notice the gathering, their eyes darting toward the group and then away, as if afraid to linger too long. Michael glanced at them briefly before focusing back on Lisa and John. "We're not here to cause a scene," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "We just want answers. Real answers." Lisa sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Look, I can't change what's already happened. What I can do is make sure we get you all reboarded and on your way as soon as possible." "And what about accountability?" Sarah asked. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight that made Lisa pause. "What about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" Lisa hesitated. "I'll note your concerns," she said finally, "and I'll make sure they're passed along to the appropriate channels." Sarah gave a small, humorless laugh. "Passed along, right, because that's always worked so well in the past." There was a long silence. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice quieter now. "This isn't just about us. It's about how things like this keep happening. In different ways. To people who look like us. And no one ever does anything about it. Lisa looked down, as if the weight of his words was too much to meet. I understand your frustration, she said softly. No, David said, shaking his head. You don't. But maybe you will if you actually listen. The group fell silent again. But this time it wasn't the same kind of silence. It was heavier, more charged, the kind of silence that often preceded change or resistance to it. Eventually, Lisa gestured toward the gate. You can reboard now, she said. We'll make sure the rest of the flight goes smoothly. The group exchanged glances but began to move. Sarah paused, turning back to Lisa. This isn't over, she said simply. Lisa nodded faintly, her expression unreadable. As the passengers reboarded, the murmurs of the other travelers followed them. Some were curious, others indifferent. Michael, Sarah, and David returned to their seats. The atmosphere on the plane now heavier than before. The flight attendants' practiced smiles did little to ease the tension. Sometimes, it wasn't about the loud, overt acts. It was about the quiet decisions, the implicit assumptions, the unspoken rules that shaped everyday life. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of something much larger. And they all knew it. 4-0. Van da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 4 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 4. The Delay. The gate area felt different now. Quieter in a way that wasn't comforting. The group of 8 passengers sat or stood nearby. Their movements deliberate. Their conversations muted. Around them, the airport carried on as usual, announcements for delayed flights. Travelers hurrying to gates. And the occasional laughter from a group far removed from the tension that surrounded Flight 832. Sarah Williams sat stiffly in one of the chairs, her hands resting on her briefcase. She wasn't one to fidget, but her thumb ran absently over the worn leather. The silence among the group wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy, each of them processing the same unspoken question. How did we end up here? Michael Thompson leaned against a nearby wall, his phone still in hand. The video he had recorded was short. Only a few minutes of clipped voices and shifting gazes. But it felt significant. He hadn't posted it yet, he wasn't sure if he would, but the idea lingered in his mind. His wife had always said he had a knack for knowing when to speak up. Maybe this was one of those moments. David Harris sat a few seats away, his notebook open on his lap. He had stopped writing, his pen hovering just above the page. His eyes moved over the words he had written earlier about resilience. About history and the voices that had risen above it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Lisa, the gate agent, approached them cautiously, her steps hesitant. She looked tired, her expression strained, though she tried to maintain a professional demeanor. I wanted to let you all know, she began, her voice low, that we're working to accommodate you. There's no other flight to Phoenix tonight, but you'll be allowed to reboard shortly. The words landed with a thud. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just unfolded, just a statement of logistics. As though that was enough to make the situation right. Allowed? Sarah repeated, her voice quiet but sharp. She looked up at Lisa, her gaze steady. You make it sound like you're doing us a favor. Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down, the clipboard in her hands, suddenly the most interesting thing in the room. Michael straightened. You're telling us we're stuck here tonight if we don't reboard, right? That's correct, Lisa admitted. And you think that's acceptable? Sarah asked. Her tone hadn't risen, but it carried the weight of someone used to asking the questions people didn't want to answer. Lisa hesitated, then said quietly, I'll make sure this incident is reported. That's all I can do right now. Sarah exhaled slowly, leaning back in her seat. It wasn't an answer, not really, but she let it go for now. They needed to get to Phoenix, and she wasn't about to jeopardize that. When the announcement finally came for reboarding, the group moved as one. Their steps slower, heavier than before. The other passengers on the flight watched them return. Some with curiosity, others with pointed indifference. A few looked away entirely, their discomfort palpable. Michael took his seat again by the window, staring out at the dark tarmac. Sarah placed her briefcase beneath the seat and folded her hands in her lap. David adjusted his glasses and picked up his notebook. Though he didn't resume writing. The flight attendants resumed their duties. Their smiles tighter now, their movements brisker. John avoided meeting anyone's eyes as he moved through the cabin. And though his demeanor hadn't changed much, there was a faint unease in his posture that hadn't been there before. As the plane taxied to the runway, the cabin grew quiet. Most passengers were settling into the rhythm of the flight, adjusting their seats, scrolling through their phones. But for Michael, Sarah, David, and the others, the atmosphere remained tense. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The weight of what had happened pressed on them like the hum of the engines, constant, unrelenting, and just loud enough to drown out the silence. They didn't speak to one another. But they didn't need to. The connection between them now was unspoken but undeniable, forged in the kind of moment that was as common as it was disheartening. When the plane finally lifted into the air, Michael glanced around the cabin. He caught Sarah's eye for a moment. Then David's. No words passed between them. But a mutual understanding lingered. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just another beginning. One they hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. And in the quiet of that flight, they began to consider what might come next. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 5 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. The landing at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport was unremarkable. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the plane rolled smoothly along the tarmac. For the other passengers, the flight's events had already faded into the background, a minor delay. A fleeting curiosity, nothing more. But for the 8 passengers who had been removed, the descent into Phoenix carried a weight that wasn't so easily shrugged off. Michael Thompson waited as the plane taxied to the gate, his phone still resting in his hand. He scrolled through the video he had recorded earlier, watching it with a quiet intensity. There was nothing dramatic in it, just a series of clipped conversations, hesitant explanations, and uneasy expressions, but the details spoke volumes. He wasn't sure what he would do with it yet, but the thought of deleting it felt wrong. Sarah Williams was the first to stand when the seatbelt sign dimmed. She moved deliberately, collecting her briefcase and straightening her jacket. Her mind was already turning over the possibilities ahead, the steps they could take. Years of experience in courtrooms had taught her that moments like this, however small they seemed, were the seeds of larger battles. David Harris followed behind her, his notebook tucked under one arm. He hadn't written anything else since the incident, but his thoughts were full. He kept replaying the scene on the jet bridge, the careful, almost scripted way the gate agent had spoken, the unspoken tension in the air. It wasn't the first time he had encountered something like this, but the familiarity didn't make it any easier. The 8 passengers regrouped near baggage claim, an unspoken understanding keeping them together. It wasn't planned, they simply drifted toward one another as though drawn by the shared weight of the experience. The bright fluorescent lights of the terminal cast long shadows, giving the scene an oddly muted feel. Sarah glanced around the group. "We should exchange contact information," she said matter-of-factly. "If we decide to pursue this, it'll help to stay connected." There were nods of agreement. Michael pulled out his phone, opening a notes app to jot down names and numbers. David offered a small, encouraging smile to the others, sensing their hesitation. "It's not about making a scene," he said softly. "It's about making sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug." One of the other passengers, a woman with short cropped hair and a steely expression, nodded. They count on us letting it go. She said. That's how they get away with it. Sarah handed Michael her card. A simple white rectangle with her name, law firm, and contact information printed in bold black letters. If you're serious about doing something, she said, her tone calm but firm. I can help. It won't be easy, but it's worth pursuing. Michael pocketed the card. I think we have to, he said after a moment. If not for us, then for whoever's next. David hesitated before speaking. I know some people in the media, he said quietly. If we're willing to go public with this, it could bring attention to the issue. It's not just about this one flight, it's about the pattern. The group fell silent, the weight of the decision settling over them. Going public would mean scrutiny, questions, perhaps even backlash, but it might also mean change, however small. One of the men, a soft-spoken retiree named James, finally spoke. I don't want to just let this go, he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. We shouldn't have to go through this. None of us should. The others murmured their agreement. The sense of solidarity was quiet but undeniable, like a thread pulling them closer together. As they began to part ways, Sarah placed a hand on Michael's arm. Keep the video, she said. It's important. You never know when you'll need proof. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll keep it. They dispersed into the terminal, each heading toward their respective destinations. The noise of the airport seemed louder now. The bustle of travelers an almost overwhelming contrast to the calm, heavy silence of their shared experience. For the 8 of them, the flight was over, but its impact lingered. It wasn't just a story of a delayed takeoff or an uncomfortable interaction, it was a reflection of something deeper. Something woven into the fabric of their lives. They carried it with them as they left. Not as a burden, but as a reminder. Injustice didn't always arrive with fanfare or drama. Sometimes, it crept in quietly, disguised as protocol or procedure. Unspoken but ever present. And sometimes, it was met not with anger, but with resolve, a quiet determination to bring it into the light. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 6 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Doc Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 6. The Legal Battle. The conference room at Sarah Williams's law office was simple and unassuming gray carpet. A long oak table, and walls lined with shelves of case law and legal references. It wasn't designed to impress, it was a space meant for work. And that's what Sarah and her clients had gathered to do. Michael Thompson sat near the middle of the table, his phone resting in front of him. He had played the video twice already, the room falling silent each time as John's voice and Lisa's uneasy explanations echoed from the small screen. Across the table, David Harris adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful as he scribbled notes into his notebook. The others sat quietly, their faces a mix of apprehension and resolve. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. This isn't just about the 8 of you, she began, her voice steady and calm. It's about a system that allows this kind of treatment to happen again and again. If we're going to pursue this, we need to think beyond this one flight. James, the soft-spoken retiree, nodded. I understand that, he said, but how do we prove it wasn't just a misunderstanding? Sarah turned to Michael. The video helps, she said. It shows the sequence of events, the lack of transparency, and the selective way they targeted you. But we'll need more. David looked up from his notebook. Patterns, he said simply. If this isn't the first time something like this has happened, we need to show that. Emails, records, complaints, anything that points to a bigger issue. Sarah nodded. Exactly. Discrimination cases are rarely built on a single incident. It's about connecting the dots, showing a culture of bias rather than a one-time mistake. Michael frowned, his brow furrowing. And what if they deny it? Say it was just protocol, like they did at the gate? They probably will, Sarah admitted, but the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when people are watching. Public pressure can make all the difference. The room fell silent for a moment. The weight of what they were undertaking was beginning to sink in. It wasn't just about filing a lawsuit, it was about stepping into the spotlight. Risking scrutiny and criticism, all for a chance at accountability. David broke the silence. I reached out to a reporter I know. He said, she's interested in hearing our story. If we're willing to go on record, she'll run a piece on it. That could help, Sarah said thoughtfully. The more attention we bring to this, the harder it'll be for them to dismiss it as nothing. Another passenger, a young woman named Angela, spoke up. What if they try to turn it around on us? Make it seem like we're overreacting? They might, Sarah said, her tone measured. But that's why we have to stay focused on the facts. This isn't about emotions or assumptions, it's about what happened and why it shouldn't have. Michael glanced at the video again, his expression hardening. They shouldn't get away with it, he said quietly. Not this time. Sarah gave him a small, encouraging nod. They won't. Not if we do this right. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The case was filed a week later. Sarah's team worked quickly, drafting a complaint that outlined the incident in detail and alleged racial discrimination by the airline. The lawsuit wasn't just about compensation. It demanded changes to the airline's training and protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. News of the case spread quickly. David's contact at the media outlet published an article about the incident, complete with Michael's video and interviews with several of the passengers. The story was picked up by other outlets, sparking a quiet ripple of conversation across social media and news networks. Public response was mixed. Many expressed outrage, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. Others dismissed it, calling the passengers too sensitive, or accusing them of looking for attention. Sarah had expected that. She knew that pushing for change often meant facing resistance, even hostility, but she also knew that the more people paid attention, the harder it would be for the airline to brush this off. Inside the courtroom, the airline's lawyers were polished and composed. They argued that their actions were in line with standard procedures, that the passengers' removal was unfortunate but necessary to address a complaint. Sarah countered with precision, using the airline's own records against them. She pointed out inconsistencies in their statements, highlighted emails that revealed gaps in training, and called witnesses who spoke about similar experiences with the same flight crew. The case dragged on for months. Each hearing brought new revelations, some small, others significant. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that was hard to ignore. By the time the trial neared its conclusion, the tide of public opinion had shifted. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Equality in the air," and "Dignity for all passengers." Social media buzzed with calls for accountability, and several prominent figures spoke out in support of the plaintiffs. Michael, Sarah, David, and the others watched it all unfold with quiet determination. They hadn't set out to become symbols of change, but they knew the importance of seeing this through. As they prepared for the final hearing, Sarah addressed the group. No matter what happens tomorrow, she said, remember this. We've already made an impact. People are paying attention. That's how change begins. The others nodded, their expressions resolute. The outcome was uncertain, but the purpose was clear. And in that quiet moment, they knew they had already won something far greater than a single case. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 7 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The courtroom was subdued that morning, the low hum of murmured conversations filling the air as people found their seats. It was a stark contrast to the growing tension outside, where protesters gathered with signs and reporters clustered with cameras, all waiting for the next twist in a case that had captured national attention. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter but no less charged. Michael Thompson sat beside Sarah Williams at the plaintiff's table. His hands folded neatly in front of him. David Harris was on his other side, his notebook resting on the polished surface. The rest of the group sat in the gallery, their presence a silent but steady reminder of why they were here. The airline's lawyers sat across the room, their expressions calm, their suits immaculate. Their confidence had been unshaken throughout the trial, bolstered by the airline's deep resources and carefully crafted defense. They spoke of procedures, protocol, and the challenges of managing a large operation. But the plaintiffs knew the truth lay somewhere beneath that polished veneer, waiting to be unearthed. Today, Sarah believed, was the day they would find it. The proceedings began with the usual formalities. Witnesses were sworn in, exhibits entered into evidence, and the steady rhythm of legal arguments resumed. But as the day wore on, the focus shifted to something new, the airline's internal communications. Sarah rose to her feet, holding a slim folder of documents. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but deliberate. "I'd like to enter these emails into evidence. They pertain directly to the airline's handling of complaints and training procedures." The judge nodded, motioning for her to proceed. As Sarah distributed copies of the emails to the defense and the jury, Michael leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding despite the composed expression he maintained. This was the moment Sarah had been working toward for weeks, a chance to pull back the curtain on the airline's practices. "Let me draw your attention to an email from the defendant's training coordinator," Sarah said, her voice steady. She walked toward the jury, holding up one of the pages. "This email, dated 6 months before the incident, discusses complaints of bias against one of the flight attendants involved in this case." She paused, letting the words sink in. In it, the coordinator notes that several employees raised concerns about the flight attendant's conduct, specifically citing instances where passengers of color felt unfairly targeted. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. The airline's lead attorney rose to object, but Sarah continued, unshaken. "Furthermore," she said, placing the document on the projector, "this email states that the complaints were not formally investigated because," and I quote, "there wasn't enough evidence to pursue." Michael's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his jaw clenching. David glanced at him briefly, offering a silent reassurance. Sarah pressed on, turning to the defense. "Do you deny the existence of these emails?" The defense attorney hesitated before responding. "The documents speak for themselves, Ms. Williams, but they don't prove systemic bias. At most, they indicate isolated concerns." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "Isolated concerns that were dismissed without action," she replied. "And yet, they align precisely with the pattern of treatment my clients experienced on Flight 832. She returned to her table, picking up another document. "But there's more. This second email, sent just weeks before the flight, details a meeting between management and the flight crew. In this email, the issue of unconscious bias is raised, and the response from leadership is, it's not a priority at this time." This time, the murmurs grew louder. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order. But the shift in the room was undeniable. Sarah turned back to the jury. "These emails paint a picture," she said, "a picture of an organization that had opportunities to address bias but chose not to. My clients weren't just victims of one person's poor judgment, they were casualties of a systemic failure." The defense attorney stood, his voice tight. "Your Honor, these emails are being taken out of context. The airline has robust training programs in place, and any isolated lapses do not constitute systemic discrimination." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the jury sit with the defense's words for a moment before speaking again. "What we've seen here," she said, her voice quieter now, "is what happens when silence becomes complicity. These weren't just lapses, they were decisions. Decisions to ignore warnings, to dismiss concerns, and to prioritize convenience over accountability." She returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. The rest of the day passed in a blur of testimony and arguments. But the weight of those emails lingered. When the session adjourned, the plaintiffs gathered outside the courthouse, their mood somber but determined. "This is far from over," Michael said quietly, his gaze fixed on the reporters assembling nearby. No, Sarah agreed. But it's a step in the right direction. As the group began to disperse, David lingered, watching the crowd. It's not just about winning the case, he said, almost to himself. It's about making them see. Making them understand. Sarah nodded. Change doesn't happen all at once, she said, but it starts with moments like this. And as they walked away, the tension that had followed them since that night on Flight 832 felt just a little lighter. Though no less significant, sometimes, the smallest cracks in the facade were the ones that let the light through. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 8 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Doc Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 8. The Resolution. The verdict was announced on an unassuming afternoon. With no fanfare or dramatic flourish. The courtroom was filled with a low hum of voices as the judge entered and the room fell into silence. For the plaintiffs Michael, Sarah, David, and the others' time seemed to stretch unbearably long as the judge began to read the decision. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, the judge said, her voice steady and clear. The defendant Airline is found to have engaged in discriminatory practices and is ordered to compensate the plaintiffs for damages incurred. Furthermore, the court mandates that the airline implement comprehensive anti-bias training and revise its policies to address systemic issues. For a moment, there was no reaction. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, before the plaintiffs exchanged brief, almost incredulous glances. Michael exhaled quietly, his shoulders sagging in relief. David placed his hand on the notebook in front of him, as if anchoring himself to the moment. Sarah, ever composed, allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. The defense team remained stoic, their polished expressions betraying nothing. Though a faint tension lingered in their posture, they quickly began gathering their documents, already strategizing for what would likely be an appeal. Asterisk. Outside the courthouse, the air was alive with energy. Reporters pressed forward, microphones and cameras thrust toward the plaintiffs as they emerged. Protesters cheered, their signs bobbing in the air. Equality takes flight, and dignity for all. Sarah stepped forward as the unofficial spokesperson, her voice calm but firm. Today's ruling is not just a victory for us but for anyone who has ever been made to feel invisible or less than. Discrimination has no place in the skies or anywhere else. This is a step forward. But the work is far from over. Michael stayed close, offering brief comments to reporters when asked. David, more reserved, lingered near the edge of the crowd, observing the moment with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't in his nature to seek the spotlight, but he understood its importance now. One of the reporters asked Michael about the video he had recorded. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod. That video was just the beginning, he said. It captured a moment. But this case is about much more than that. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what we did. Asterisk. In the weeks that followed, the ruling sent ripples through the airline industry. Other companies began reviewing their policies, some proactively announcing changes to training programs and diversity initiatives. The story of Flight 832 became a case study, a reminder that systemic issues couldn't be ignored forever. The airline itself issued a public apology. Its CEO stood in front of cameras and spoke of lessons learned, of commitments to fairness and equity. For some, the words rang hollow, too little, too late, but for others, they were a necessary step, however imperfect, toward change. Sarah, Michael, and David kept in touch, though their lives began to drift back to their respective rhythms. For Michael, the experience had deepened his resolve to use his platform to advocate for others. For David, it became a story he shared with his students not just as an example of injustice but as proof that standing together could lead to change. And for Sarah, it was another chapter in a career spent fighting for those who couldn't fight alone. One evening, months after the case had concluded, The three of them gathered at a small coffee shop in Phoenix. It was quiet, the kind of place where conversations flowed easily without fear of being overheard. I still think about that night, Michael admitted, stirring his coffee. How it started so small. Just a seat on a plane. A routine flight. It could have been anyone. David nodded. It's the everyday things that show us who we are, he said. Not the big, dramatic moments. The small choices. The quiet assumptions, those are what shape the world. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. And it's the everyday things that can change it, she said, one step at a time. They sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in their thoughts. Outside, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a quiet, ordinary moment, and yet it carried the weight of everything they had been through. Sometimes, change didn't come with loud declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes, it came in the steady, quiet determination to push forward, to demand better, and to believe that progress, however slow, was still progress. And for them, that was enough.